Hello, I'm Ron Lemon, and this is Level Up with Lemonade, a side mission, part 2. In this video, we'll be looking at the head and the neck in George Bridgman's anatomy book. Now, this section is dense with visual information, but not a lot of written information to accompany that. So hopefully this breakdown will help make it a lot easier for you to understand what he was trying to accomplish with all the different subsections within this chapter. We'll be looking at planes, forms, the skeleton, a little bit of the anatomy, but he doesn't really cover a lot within the face, mostly in the jaw and in the neck, how to render different types of forms, and a whole lot more. If you watch the first video, then you have a little bit of background into his technique and what he was trying to accomplish within this book. The first video shows the breakdown of all the different things that he's using within each chapter of each part of the body. So this should be no different than what you watched in the first one, only the difference would be the information that we're looking at today. There is a lot of information, and it's broken down in the timeline so you can find the section that you're looking for in particular. So because there's a lot to do here, let's go ahead and jump right in. Section 1 of this chapter is on the skull. So in the first part of the head and neck section, he's describing the shapes of the skull, and he's talking about the body of the skull and then the jaw in addition to that. But what's more important about this section is that he's describing the skull as a box form, where there's these very specific points on the skull that help separate the sections into planes, and looking for this sort of planar construction to help make the skull feel more dimensional and full. When drawing the portrait, especially when the light is on the model or someone is evenly lit both in the front and the side view of the head, it's very difficult to find that boundary line that separates one surface from the other. And this is something that you have to train yourself to understand, or train to understand within a classroom setting or a mentorship setting. Understanding that helps create that transition from the one side to the other side. He's also labeling all the different sections, which you can see here on these skulls, labels on them, to help explain where each particular section of the skull is. I think he says there's 22 sections of the skull. We really don't need to know all of this as far as being an artist is concerned, but understanding places like the mastoid process and where the occipital section shifts from the parietal section, because that is going from the back to the side, and the parietal to the frontal, and the temple and the cheekbone. These are important. And then understanding that the jaw is separate from the rest of the skull is also important. The jaw hinges right inside of here. This is something that he draws on several pages within the head section, designing the head as a cube. And I've tried to put all the markings in there that he's used. And as we advance, I will also have the lines that he describes through this, where finding the base of the ear is also finding the base of the nose. And then the center line that comes down through the nose. This is sort of his Bridgman cross, the more important aspect of finding the front of the head. Then everything else is designed around that cross. And then one part of this section also has the muscles of the jaw. And I think it's because he's talking about the jaw being separated from the rest of the skull and how it's attached. We have the temporalis muscle that's attached to the front of the jaw through here. The masseter is attached to the zygomatic arch through here. The buccinator muscle is attached to the inner edge of the jaw along here, and then connects to the orbicularis oris, which is the mouth muscle, or the muscle that surrounds the mouth. And then he also makes mention of the zygomatic muscles through this section of the face. He has another page dedicated to the anatomy, but it has no descriptions on it whatsoever about any of the other muscles, which I do think is kind of important. If you are going to learn the face, there's certain muscles like the orbicularis oculi that goes around the eyeball, and the muscles that are on the forehead that articulate the eyebrows and the expression within the eyes. If you want more information about that, you can refer to my masterclass series 3A and 3B, where I go over the muscles of the human body. 3A is where I cover the head muscles with the axial skeletal portion of the body. The rest of this section is drawings of the skull from various angles. And again, if you know his process from the previous video that I described using hatch lines to help turn the corners of the form, then you'll be able to do some pretty decent studies from these drawings. Section 2 is an order of drawing the head Bridgman's way. So this is one of those chapters that reveals a part of the process, and it's not really a full chapter. Kind of remember that in this book it's broken up into sections, and the chapters are sort of like each body section. So the head is one chapter, and there's lots of these sub chapters or subsections within it. And this is an important one here, although all it is this is what you do, and this is how you do it. This line, then this line, then this line, then this one. And there isn't a lot that goes along with it to help you understand how and why. Just do it this way. Now, in his process, the important thing that he's looking at as far as the start of the measure is the baseline of the nose that lines up with the ears. Now, if you know anything about our modern methodologies of breaking the head up into thirds or thirds with a little bit, thirds with a little bit would be the 3 sections of the face, and then a little bit more above that for the hairline. It starts with these. The thirds that we break the face into in a lot of the more modern methods has the nose and the ear base as one of the points of measure along the way. So obviously this guy started the whole ball rolling with these measurements, and that's the one that he begins the drawing with, because it's important to align the ears and the nose to each other to get the perspective of the head correct. That was his big thing. Not so much got to get the eyes in first or any other features. It's literally getting the perspective correct on the head. So his method is to kind of break up the skull into a few sections. We start with the outline of the forms. We have along the cheek line, through the jaw, into the chin, and then the cranial mass. So it's cheek section, jaw section, cranial mass. Then the neck, making sure that the neck is drawn in on both sides with a hint of the shoulders to go along with it. Because that is, if you're going to judge the head and the head tilt, you have to judge it against something measurable. The neck and the shoulders are like a vertical and a horizontal. If your neck is like this and the shoulders are like this, then when you tilt the head, you'll be able to see the tilt very clearly because of those other 2 stable points of the pose. Once the neck is in, and he's also pit of the neck, right? The pit of the neck is an important one, and the throat, which also kind of indicates the sternocleidomastoideus muscles. Then it's the center line. And then after the center line, you put in the nose, or the baseline for the nose, which is then going to help you find the baseline for the ears. Now, a lot of these drawings that he does throughout this chapter will have either the side of the head or under the nose as the second line of measure to work from, the center line being the first, this one being the second, then the cheek line being third, crossing through the cheek line, and then all the other points. It's going to vary, and I'll explain that when we get there, why they change so often, which I think is one of the confusing things about this chapter, is that you'll draw one drawing and it'll have things in a certain order. You'll get to another one and they'll be in a different order. And it's like, well, but there's no explanation anywhere in here as to how to govern this. So anyway, now that the bottom of the ears are in, then we find the bottom of the nose,
We put in a line for the mouth, for the start of the chin, across where the eyes are going to go, and then the brow above the eyes, then the hairline. And we have our points of measure. And then we bring in the side plane of the face. Draw that down to the chin, finding that with the forehead and the separation of the forehead from the side planes. The glabella, or in this case, he's just calling them the eye sockets, and then completing the hairline. And we have this pathway now. We have the outer contour and we have the inner contour. And along that inner contour, we change some of the angles down through here to complete the contour design and put the anatomy in the appropriate places according to the jaw, the cheeks, and the forehead space. Bring this line up a little bit to the top of the skull, or closer to the top of the skull, and then find the peak. So you're constantly adjusting things as you're building through. And regardless of whether it's down tilt, up tilt, or straight forward, it's the same lines over and over again. Section 3 is Bridgman's method for drawing the head in perspective. Bridgman starts this chapter with the cube form again, what we saw in the first section of this video. And he alludes to something important here at the very last sentence of this paragraph. In parallel perspective, all proportions, measurements, and locations are made on the plane that faces you. So in drawing a square, a cube, or a head, draw the nearest side first, which is his method. So the reason why the lines that he uses might start off in a different order is because he's drawing the surface that is facing closest to us. These heads are drawn in what you call the 60-degree cone of vision. In perspective, the 60-degree cone of vision is where right angles stay true. Anything beyond this cone, if you happen to draw the perspective outside of it, anywhere along in here, you're not going to have the same cone of vision. You're going to have what will be skewed, something that has a lot of distortion to it, where none of these have distortion to them. They're all flat facing. And again, within the 60-degree cone of vision, things stay true to their scale or their orientation. They're not pushed in a skewed fashion, where anything outside of the cone of vision starts to stretch in an awkward way, making it look less than realistic. So to do this, you would first draw your 60-degree cone of vision, then find your horizon line. Then somewhere within this, doesn't matter where you put it, there will be a vanishing point. He's indicating that by putting a vertical line in there. That's the crosshairs for the vanishing point. Then find the forwardmost corner and begin drawing the closest plane to us. These will converge on the horizon line. Then drawing the face or the skull shape. In this case, I'm going to draw it in a circular way. We would then look for those crosshairs and begin with the ear. Once the ear has been found, then move over to the nose. Once the bottom of the nose has been found, then move on to the cheek plane. Then everything else. Mouth, chin, shaping all of this up so it has more articulation. And all the features should head over towards those vanishing points as well. Hairline, eyeline, brow line, mouth, under the lower lip, chin, and so forth. Everything is going to skew back into space towards those vanishing points. But everything will stay true within this space because we kept it within the 60-degree cone of vision. We'll line up all the features appropriately because we found the baseline first of the two key features that stay in line with one another, and then built everything else off of the system that Bridgman created. The thing that's missing is the tooth barrel, the cheekbone structure, the forehead structure more specifically, things that we are going to find in the next section of this chapter. Here he has several variations of the skull in different perspective, different tilts of perspective. Think of it like perspective as being a new process of drawing pictures, and he's introducing that process. This chapter is written in kind of an old language, so some of the concepts or some of the tools that he uses are described a little bit differently than what we label them now, but they're the same set of tools. So he's created here a couple rules for us to follow. First, retreating lines, whether above or below the eye, tend toward the level of the eye. Second, parallel retreating lines meet at the parallel retreating lines meet at the level of the eye. The point where parallel retreating lines meet is called the vanishing point. So he's giving you insight into perspective tools, but relating them to the human form. And again, because we're in this 60-degree cone of vision, everything will stay true to the scale that it should be, and there won't be any skew to it. And then finally, he shows us a few more examples of the box forms surrounding the skull at various head tilts. Although these two right here are very close to the same drawing. Keep in mind that all of this stuff is invention that he's working on. When he was doing his lectures, he was generating drawings based upon invention. So he's showing that if you master this technique or this methodology, you should not have any difficulty getting what you're looking for at whatever angle or tilt you choose to draw it at. Section 4 is the distribution of masses of the skull. So in his conversation here, he's talking about this block for the forehead. Now he's using the front plane, which if, again, you're used to some of the more modern methods, we use a more circular space, and you can kind of see that in the highlights in a photograph or even in shadows, that it's kind of curvilinear along here. But considering that Bridgman is trying to make things look very machinated, and it's the first time in describing all of this and designing all of this, the block makes sense. So the forehead has this very block-like feel to it. That's this plane across here. Then the cheekbone area is this gigantic wedge of a space along in here. This is all cheekbone mass. And it is and it isn't, because the muzzle also closes down this block and takes away some of these other little corners, but we're looking at a generalization here. The zygotes, which are the actual cheekbones themselves, are a block across here. There's kind of a part that sticks out on both sides of our face that's a little bit wider than the rest of the face plane. And that's over here. And it also passes to the side of the head. Then we have the tooth cylinder. In this case, I would like to call it actually a tooth barrel, because it doesn't really just look like this as a cylinder. It actually looks more like this. It has a curved quality to it in both particular directions. It's curved this way, and it's curved in this direction. So if you can think of it more like this, you're a lot closer to the actual type of design where the mouth is positioned. And then the jaw is everything else on the head here, and he calls that a giant triangular form. And it's triangular not just in this direction, but it's also triangular in this direction, right? So if we're looking down at the head, the jaw has a wedge-like feeling like this, and that's this particular space right here that he's describing. The chin is a part of this kind of wedge or triangular space. Then these areas are hollowed out more. This is the soft material between the teeth and the extrusions of the cheek and the jaw. So the skin sort of falls over this, but these are not hard surfaces. He is describing literally the harder surfaces. Then if you remember back to the previous video where he has the section called moldings, that's what he's showing here, the molding design, where you have undercuts that are darker, you have planes that are facing forward that have a lighter value to them, right? The undercuts and the surfaces facing upward. On a younger person or on somebody with a more rounded head, you're going to see the distribution of masses something like this. And on an older head or a more structured, developed face, you're going to be seeing it wedging a lot more. And then the last page in this section is showing the face fleshed over, but where these masses are coming from within the skull. So once again, we're looking at the block forehead, which in this case, he's kind of rounded out now, much closer to the design structure that we use today. Then he has, and it's interesting because he's following the zygomatic bones here and here that lead into the block shape of the cheeks. So I'm wondering if there was a conversation ever about the wedging of the sockets or not. And then the tooth barrel. And then the jaw, as it goes back in space in both of these different directions. And this is the hard mass. This is the hard surfaces that he's been describing in this chapter. It actually should have started with this page, so that there's a better understanding of what all of these surface forms he's describing are coming from. It's not the soft tissue, it's the skeleton. So regardless of who the model is, or the photo that you're drawing from, or the head that you're making up, if you balance between starting with the oval like we usually do, and then plotting where within that ovoid space you have these harder surfaces protruding through, you have a greater chance of designing something that feels much more solid, that feels much more contextual and even believable. The wedging of the forehead, the cheekbone structure, the tooth cylinder, and the chin, as I'm falling off the bottom of the page here. These areas, and then the nose isn't really a hard surface. It's made up of cartilage and soft flesh. So he's not adding that to this particular conversation because it's not bone. Everything within this section is bone. The nose has a softness to it, but it still has its construction. And even with that, if you can design it, this is a horseshoe-like shape that goes from one side to the other, the side planes, the front, and the very bottom of it. If you can think of the nose in the same kind of way, then you'll have a much more structural nose. A lot of people have a tendency to just draw an outline with nostrils. And that, while that gives us an indication of where the nose might be, it doesn't actually build the structure of the nose, where we need both sides of the nose visible, and both sides of the nose, or all three sides, or all four sides, depending upon the angle, visible for us to see and feel the contextual three-dimensionality in the same way we do with the head. They go one and the same with one another. But the first and foremost masses that are important are these particular masses of the skull. Section 5 is a construction method for the features. The title of this section is a little misleading because it's not like he starts with the oval first as part 1 and so forth. He's already done that in a previous page. So this title is redundant to what's going on here. I think it should be more like the order of how you place the features within a skull that's already built. And this is where things might get a little bit confusing. On this page, he has a few drawings that correspond with some sketches above that are shaded. Each of these three heads are the three heads above. And he's showing the linear process of finding where the features go. But this is where he's breaking down his construction, so to speak. And this is the part that's a little bit confusing, because if you notice in this first drawing here, he has the underside of the nose as line 4 and the cheek as line 2. Where in this one, he has the underside of the nose as number 2 and the side plane is number 4. So if you didn't read the previous chapter or the previous section within this chapter, then you would be confused as to what the heck is going on here, because those numbers are completely backward or out of order to each other. While number 1 is consistent with all of these and number 3 is consistent with all of these. So what he's basically saying is that whichever surface is facing more towards you, let's just make this one the one facing more towards us, and we would have to kind of develop that skull shape again. Remember, going around the head and beginning with these simple lines, regardless of the turn of the head, except with the exception of the profile. Most of the forward-facing and three-quarter view heads could start this way very easily. Start with that center line, then find the base of the nose, then the cheek plane, then the ear, which falls in line with the nose. But it's in that particular order: line 1, line 2, line 3, and then line 4. It's in that particular order that he's building the baseline features for the perspective of the head. Then everything else follows suit. We'll look at the proportions of these in a different section, which again is kind of all over the place. And that's what makes this particular part of the book so difficult, is that all the information is there, but it's broken up into these weird places and kind of out of order. But once you learn how it all fits together by piecing those sections together, this whole thing makes a bunch more sense and is a lot easier to use. Section 6 is on the planes of the head. The concept of planes of the head is very similar to what he's already discussed with massing, having the bigger blocks placed in certain locations within the head design to help facilitate structure and develop the form even further. You might be familiar with planes of the head very similar to this kind of thing. This is a more modernized version, although this too dates all the way back to ancient antiquity. The planes of the head, we have molds of masks from all the way back to the Grecian times. So this is not a concept that is lost to us and we're only just now finding it. It's been around for a long time. It describes building something that doesn't feel formless. It gives weight and character, as well as dividing space to the portrait or the figure for that matter, or anything else that you happen to draw. Outline isn't enough, of course. It's what is sitting in between the outlines that gives something that volumetric feeling. Now, the thing to be careful of when doing the plane structure of a head is not to draw one facet at a time, because this is going to lead to confusion and a broken feeling as opposed to a harmonious feeling. Start the head the way that you normally would with an oval. Find your axes lines, your center axes, your crosshairs in whatever fashion of feature finding you do. And if you're going along with Bridgman, then it would be the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the ear to start everything off. Then the 3/4 line of the head. So the ear would fall back over here. The nose happens along here. And once the bigger sections have been found, then you can start faceting, finding where the forehead might fit, finding the different planes of the side of the skull. from the temple line, the forehead to the temple, and then from the temple to the side plane to the top of the skull, and so forth. Especially when it comes to features like the nose. That one is really important that we divide into its structural surfaces, because the nose is one of those areas on the head that loses a lot and kind of reduces the quality of the portrait down when it doesn't have the structure built into it. One of the things we also need to remember is that as we extrude each of these features, we need to retrace the center line over those features. The initial line that we work with is more like an axis line. It shows us where the center is of the basic object, its tilt, its turn, and its tip in 3D space. But then from there, we build everything else up. Now, as you study, this is a good way to build. But as you develop a piece of art, then you have to find another way to bring in or introduce that structure. And that's going to be through the way that you use your tones, and you develop some kind of either shading process or hatching process that shows dips and turns, facets, undulations, bevels, and so forth within the structure. For this kind of linear thinking, I would refer to the great comic book artists, the great inkers of past like Joseph Clement Cole or Charles Dana Gibson. As well, if you can align Gibson with his counterpart, John Singer Sargent, you could look at the brushstrokes of the Impressionists. Because if you can follow these strokes that go into developing the surfaces, you'll start to see how others before us made this possible, building structure into something that we're trying to create as an illusion, rather than somebody looking at a picture that's full of technique. We want them to get lost in the believability of it. But we have to hide that structure into the form through the technique that we use. Now, all of the pages within this chapter are basically the same page, just with different examples. As you can see here, the structure is very sound. We can see all of the different divisions. They've been shaded with hatch lines, and even like where the lighter halftones are, there's an indication of a few hash marks that shows the change of a plane or the change of a surface. And that's what the lines are there for. Like this little divot here, that's a change in direction within the brow shape that goes up and over. It's indicated by here, here, and here. And then our imagination fills in here and here. A few lines here and a few lines here isolate a shape in 3D space. A few lines along here shows the division between the dimple line and the muzzle. The lines underneath here show the undulation of the lower lip, as well as the beginning of the chin ball as that turns into a different plane structure as it's moving down the head. All of these are well designed and well placed without competing with one another. The most important areas to first factor in are the shadows. Once all of the shadows have been placed, then we build the halftones, starting with the darkest, and then questioning whether we need any of the other ones as they get lighter. If we have enough indications, we don't need to just keep adding and adding and adding information. It's the consolidation of the information that makes something really strong, meaningful, and fun to look at. With this particular page, it shows rounded forms or soft forms and how they have been broken up into planes. The few indications that are within the surface area shows a change of direction. Like these two lines as an example, the forehead sits here, and then there's the side plane that comes up to the forehead. And those few lines stop at the change of direction, which helps indicate two different surfaces, one over here and one right here, without over describing. Just like the lines that surround the chin ball here, the undercut, the tubercle of the lower lip, the line that crosses where the ball of the chin begins, the line underneath where the chin ends, and the side walls over here and over here that isolate where the chin is in respect to the rest of the head. It's carefully decided upon. The jawline under here, the change of direction between the jawline itself and the masseter, and then another indication here separating the chin from the jawline. It's all carefully planned and well designed. You're going to hear that word a lot when I'm describing these drawings. Design is critical. It's your thought process that helps reduce or enhance that design. Now here is where he sort of describes the big general planes. As you can see within the head sphere, he has a very distinct forehead is important because it overhangs the eye sockets, and the eye sockets are an undercut to the forehead. The forehead also has a transitional plane before it reaches the temple, which is this edge right along here. Then there's the triangular space that makes up the cheekbones and the rest of the face on its way down to the chin, which he also separates very deliberately, and the jawline as that goes back towards the ear, with the masseter muscle as its own separate section, the jaw from the masseter. On the profile line, we can also see that change in direction. And then he's shorthanding the back of the skull, giving it a more rounded form, which it does have. The back of the skull is more ball-like, but that ball is also broken into planes across here, between the top and the side, back along in here that separates the side from the back view or the posterior view. And then there's a small plane underneath here that shows the bottom of the skull, which is where the trapezius muscle comes and intersects it. By knowing these divisions specifically, once again, the head has a lot of structure to it that is visual and dimensional. Everything that we need to make something feel more dimensional and believable as opposed to just contour driven and just a shape, right? Because without the information between the big contour that we've made, it literally looks flat. Now this page introduces the nose into the equation. Bringing in the nose, I'm not really hip on his flatness through here. Most of us have a change of direction between the forehead, the glabella, which is what this space is here, and the bridge of the nose. So I'm not inclined to draw all of these flat into one another. But I understand what he's trying to say. He is saying that the nose is an extension of the forehead. There's a side plane to the nose, and we need to remember that too, because that is something that a lot of people forget when rendering the face. The eye sockets are an undercut that separates the forehead from the rest of the face down along in here. And that's the intention and the goal of these particular images, to show that change of direction. Just like over here, the side plane of the skull, knowing, and I don't understand this rhythm here at all. It really doesn't make any sense because the cheekbone sits along here, and then this becomes part of the temple that flows back. I'm not sure because obviously we weren't there to watch him do this. I don't know what his intention was in designing the shape in that particular way, unless he's saying this is the beginning of the side plane and it's broken into two parts, above the zygomatic arch and below the zygomatic arch. But I'm only guessing or speculating upon that. Then these two particular views deal with the muzzle shape and the way that the planes taper. He's saying that the chin is the widest and it goes down into the philtrum, narrows down into the philtrum, which again isn't necessarily the right way to think about it, because some people have a wider muzzle, some people have a narrower muzzle. But if you're looking at the philtrum and the front planes of the lips in relationship to the chin, there is some kind of change in volume as it goes up underneath the nose, but that change can vary with each individual. And then this last page goes into breaking up the side plane along the jawline. How we're looking at the bone across here and the change of direction back here where the masseter muscle sits. This is where the masseter muscle sits. This is not necessarily exposed bone, but the muscles do not define the face along this particular passage as much as they do here, through here, and so forth. And then he's showing that same relationship when it comes to the actual skeleton. It doesn't dip in this hard, but there is a change in direction. And do remember this about anything art related. If it's good quality art, it caricatures what we see. It doesn't copy it exactly. And he's pushing the caricature so that you understand the visuals very clearly. He's over defining it so you can actually see it when it feels non-existent when you're looking at a normal skull or somebody's head where all the features blend together. At least you have some kind of visual awareness of how to look for the change in direction within the feature forms. Section 7 is blocking the head in the profile view. This section of the book is another one of those sections that's a bit deceiving because we now know the profile to be as a side view of the head, where he's using both the side view as well as the 3/4 view and calling both of those profiles. So that could be a little bit confusing if you do come from head drawing and you already know these distinctions: front view, 3/4 view, profile view, or side view. What he's doing on this page is relating all three of the views to one another in their measures and aligning the lines so that you can see that those lines traverse all the way around the form regardless of the view you're seeing. I think the biggest takeaway here is this particular drawing over here. The brow does not line up with the mouth underneath. There might be some instances where the face is really flat like this, but the brow is back from the muzzle, which is forward for most faces. Now remember, there might be every now and again a unique instance where everything does line up with one another, but this is extremely rare. This is more like how all the features in profile view fit with one another. And again, this is the key takeaway for this particular page. Then he shows the head below and above. He's still calling this a profile view. We're looking at the head in profile, even though we're seeing both the front plane and the side plane at the same time. And he's using his box design to show. And this one is interesting too, because he's using the box design a little bit differently. He has the box smaller, but he also adjoins the 3/4 space here and here within a larger box frame, showing that this is somewhere, and I'm not really sure what this indication necessarily means. Here is his crosshair again. The helix starts along this axis line and then spirals around, terminates against this edge here. Now, what this space indicates here, I'm not quite clear on that, because it's definitely not the bottom of the chin as shown here. There's more length to it, but it should be. That should be roughly where the bottom of the skull finishes. But what he's doing is he's finding that projection line, then traversing it in 3D space across the face plane, finding where the bottom of the nose fits. And he's saying, look, these are part of the same indication along here, and then takes everything else away so that you can see the relationship and probably where the ear begins on the other side of the head, which would be this point here. Then he brings everything else back in to complete the head. So his lesson is probably more about how we judge these two axes lines between each other in this kind of view, as opposed to it being about what goes on down here in the jawline. And then he breaks it down into a more technical direction, starting with his box and then applying it to one of the many different demonstrations that he has within the book. So he's going from the cube to an actual skull to show that demonstration. Then we have the top view, which again, he is building square within a square, starting with a larger square and going to a smaller square, projecting the 3/4 turn within the larger square, indicating his corner point where the helix starts and spirals around to the jawline, putting on the eyeball form, or showing this in reference to glasses. Because the glasses are flat, he's basically saying that this is the line that you look for that indicates where the eyes go. But more importantly, it's this line here that traverses from one side of the head to the other side of the head that he's more interested in finding. The center line and then the extrusion of the nose, where we don't see under the nose in this case, we see the side plane of the nose. And then extending the jaw back down the 3/4 edge and the brow overhang. So he's giving us this technical breakdown of how he would find these forms, and then goes on to show it with an actual fleshed out skull within the same kind of demonstration. And he is following that convention of line 1 is the center of the face to find where the nose will fit relative to left side and right side of the skull. Line 2, the closest surface to us, finding where the ear is, letting that cross through the box form, then finding the cheek plane in reference to that. Then finally traversing across to find the underside of the nose, which in my case is a very short nose. The brow should actually be up a little bit higher in this demonstration to keep things more legit in their scale. But all in all, the key takeaway here is finding the tilt by finding the forward edge, plotting the ear, and then traversing across the face plane to find the underside of the nose within what he's calling the profile view, what we actually call the 3/4 view in this instance. Section 8 is blocking in the head in round, cube, or oval form methodologies. In this section of the book, Bridgman is breaking up how to construct the head in 3 manners within kind of a rounded, generalized way, a cube-like manner, and an oval or egg-like shape, which is roughly what most heads look like. And it's more like profile view, overall, and front view, meaning rounded is more profile-like. Overall, the general overall design is kind of in a cube space. And from the front view, we see the head a little bit more oval-like or egg-like. Now, what he's saying from the profile view is that the skull is kind of rounded. You have the back of the skull, which has a curvature to it. It comes down into the jaw, which is also rounded. That blends in with the underside of the chin, which also contributes to the curviness. The features are a little more forward, in which he's calling the inferior maxillary space. And then the upper portion where the forehead is also has a tendency to be a little more rounded looking. Now he's shading these to also indicate that in through this cross section here is also rounded. It's not just a block, but it has a roundness to it, especially for certain people, right? Some people do have a more rounded head. Others have a more block-like head. And others are a combination and or egg-like in the top to bottom construction. And in this particular section of the book, he's not separating these into round heads, cube heads, and egg or oval heads. He's saying that there's a few different key functions to approaching the design of the head. And if we can think about each view, or we have options to think through when it comes to the design of the head. And when you see your sitter up in front of you, or in the photo instance for a lot of you who are studying from photos, which one best serves for the moment? If you have a circular head, why start with a rectangle? It's completely different. Begin with the roundedness of it and then develop from there. The divisions that we use can fit into any of these proportions, but he is also separating the idea of divisions between the block, the oval, and this particular approach, the rounded form. In the upper 3/4 view, like we see here, again, the underside and this edge over here all sort of fit together into the roundedness of the skull. Since we're looking up, a lot of these lines are drawn this way, also going upward, up and over, and it's also enhancing that roundedness within the design. Here he's saying there are certain views and there are certain people where you're going to see a combination of these shapes. Down in here, he has a rounded form with a more block-like forehead attributed to it. And that's going to give the head structure again, because not all forms are completely round and not all forms are completely block-like. It's the combination of the two that gives balance to the skull. And that is what we're trying to do in our design. We're trying to balance the shape language out so that it doesn't feel lacking in structure and it's not over-constructed with too many harsh angles that don't feel human anymore. What he's showing here is a cross-section of where things have a tendency to be more block-like, more block-like, more block-like, more block-like, and where things, and the corner of the jaw, and where rounded forms kind of come into play and soften that distribution of rectilinear lines. More block-like out in front, and the combination of the two balance the head out and make it feel more human. Again, it's not one over the other, it's a combination of them, and it's picking the right kind of design choice as you start the portrait to match the portrait's likeness or caricature. And we've been seeing all sorts of chapters with his cube construction already, this method right down along in here, where he singles out the form by boxing it in and then dividing the headspace into its components using his 3-line structure. First finding the center line, then finding the closest face to us and indicating where the ear is in relationship to the tip of the head or the tilt of the head. Then finding the 3/4 edge where the cheek line is to help visualize the division between the front and the side plane. And then finally locating where the base of the nose goes in reference to the base of the ear to keep all of that perspective correct to one another. And then there's his example of what look like a bunch of sugar cubes that are all dropped into one another, and then proceeding to build an exercise where he's using cube construction to form the heads regardless of the tip, tilt, or turn. This is an exercise, and we should all attempt this exercise. In fact, if you do take my classes and you do the tumbling cube exercise, it might be a good idea to take all those cubes and then project skulls into them. You're getting a 2-for-1 out of the exercise, one being the tumbling cubes to practice angle and the difference in face size depending upon how far you rotate it. And then 2, building something a bit more organic into it, like the head. Now, in our modern methodology, we differentiate between cube and box. Box can be any shape other than a cube and can include a cube, but we would then say it's a cube-like box, where box forms have an irregular measure to them, and the front of the head in its measure is roughly 2/3 the width of the profile. The profile fits into a square. The front, again, is 2/3 the width of this. And that's how we do the measuring from the front to the side of the human form. This is a little more appropriate. But, I mean, if you want to caricature something, there's nothing wrong with putting the head inside of a perfect cube. It's just not going to feel as normal as the majority of heads do. Not to say that somebody doesn't have cube-like proportions, because there are. There's a whole multitude of proportions, but what we're looking for is some kind of unified standard that we can practice on a daily basis to help us recognize and memorize the information. If it was wild and everything was constantly changing, we would never feel like we're getting anywhere, or that we're actually accumulating knowledge that's going to help us solve problems later on. So this is all of a standard form of measure in an ideal sort of way, which goes back to the Greek ideal, going back to the ancients and taking note of the way that they measured their sculptures in this idealistic manner. So there's a formula involved here that we begin to memorize. And like any formula, it is intended to deviate from that formula once you understand what you're doing. And here are a few more of the cube-like measures that he's showing us, just to reinforce the fact that this is a legitimate process, and regardless of the angle that you pose the head in, you should be able to build off of that and accomplish what you need. And then finally, the last page in this series of pages with the construction in mind, he's describing the oval or the egg-like shape, where the top of the cranium is wider than the chin is narrower. And this is your sort of standard head or ideal kind of head. And he's not saying that it's all ovoid. He's just saying that there's also oval-like forms that we might be studying from. And notice that he has a front view, and he also has the 3/4 view, both in top and bottom views, from underneath and from above. This is where you're going to see the oval a lot more often than you would see it circular or rectilinear. But you can use any of the measuring types of measuring, but you can use any type of measuring system with any of the head types that you see, that you study from. It's just that some are a closer fit to what you need at that moment than others, but it doesn't disregard the others at all. So this is, again, another one of those little confusing places in the book where we kind of think like, okay, well, there's square heads and there's round heads and then there's oval heads, but it's not really that he's describing. He's just giving us options as to how to start with a certain form of measure that's a lot closer or more indicative of the scale and the shape that you might see the model, and gives you these different options to work from. Section 9 is about rendering the head with light and shade. Now, the words that George Bridgman uses to describe shading, he says that it's a very clear, distinct difference between the lit side of the form and the shaded side of the form. And we don't want to confuse it or muddle it with lighter values or additional values out into the light that are very close. Given that we have very different circumstances now for lighting the model, from north light rooms to extreme spotlights to almost anything else in between, the goal here is to understand that the planes of the head, the masses of the head, are fixed and absolute, and that the light doesn't just sort of drift across the face, or the shadows don't just randomly drift across the face. They fall distinctly into the different planes: the side plane, the front, the top, the back, the bottom. As you can see here with his first page description, the edge boundary along the side plane of the head creates an absolute boundary. So not only is the side of the head over here lit, but the side of the nose is as well. And portions of the muzzle that are also, and the chin that are facing towards that light source. And then everything else on the front of the head is absolutely in the dark. Now there's transitional areas like right up along in here because it still faces towards the light, but that distinction, that barrier in between, is an absolute division. And when you're shading, you don't want it to be randomly light or somewhere at the point where when you put halftones in, they match the value of your shadow. You want a very clear shadow, a very clear darkness on one side, so that if you do put descriptive halftones in on the other, There's no competition between the two. The shadow is very clear and distinct, as is the border where the light and shadow meet each other. There is a transitional edge along here, but you don't push those gradations until you define the shadow very clearly. And as he says here, the masses of the head are represented by planes. When the head is turned, the division of the planes are always the same. However turned, the masses of the head remain the same. Planes are front, top, and sides, as well as bottom. He forgot to put that one in. But those planes, again, are very distinct, and so is the shadow pattern falling along those planes. As you can see in both of these examples, whether the head is tipped or facing forward, there's still this very sturdy boundary line that both of them have in a very similar way, as well as this, right? He has a larger masseter muscle, so the masseter muscle sticking out is going to have a hint of light on it. But the rest of that face, regardless of whether the head is facing downward or tipped upward, forward towards the light source, the light and shadow are still going to fall into the same places. And here he has transitional forms, one of them being the fully rendered head, and the other being kind of a graphic example without the features placed in it, which is exactly this right here. The forehead, the sockets, the face, the cheek planes of the face, the muzzle and the chin, as well as the front edge of the nose or the front forward face of the nose are all in shadow, while the side planes are in the light. We saw this in another example previously. And this is the kind of design in cross-section that we're looking at with the nose extrusion. The face planes aren't perfectly flat. They are slightly angled back. But if the light is on the side of the head, neither of those planes will receive the light. They will still be shadow related. Have a conception of a solid body. A decided difference between light and shade. So when you have a clear-cut boundary because you've designed it in, regardless of which side you shade, that boundary traps the shadow and traps the light within their own spaces. Again, there are some transitional edging that turns the form in a few places, but that's a gradation. The gradation is put in after you've found the clear definition of where the shadow pattern sits. This is a hard concept for a lot of people first starting when they draw because they want to render. But rendering is broken into stages, and when you can understand what it is you're searching for within the render, it makes shading so much easier to do and speeds up the process immensely. The last thing he mentions here, which is also a really important one, is there are no near tones between the light and shadow, and there are no near tones of equal size or intensity. So that means the light and the shadows will not be of the same proportion. You can't have a 50-50 face. Even if there was a 50-50 face, you would still break that with the bridge of the nose, which is going to make one side lit and the other side in shadow. So with the forehead will fall into the same circumstance because there's a frontal plane. Now, the exception to the intensity of the light and shadow would be on an overcast day or when we have lights that are larger than a spotlight. And keep in mind that when George Bridgman was teaching, you had the spotlight and the sun. These big gigantic light bays for Hollywood were Hollywood, and I don't think he knew about them or he used them at all. He was also very strict on the type of light that would be used to light the model because that's how you're going to see light and shadow. He used a spotlight. The spotlight is sort of indicative of the sun, a very direct and deliberate light source that makes clear-cut shadows. Studying under north light is something that a more advanced painter is going to do. But to describe form and to learn form, you don't want north light as your light source because it obscures the boundaries. North light is also much larger. A very large window or whatever the kind of light source is that you've purchased that has multiple lights within a box. Both of those are going to create an obscure lighting situation, which is going to make it very difficult for somebody who's learning how to draw see the forms more clearly. To see the form, you need a singular direct light source. A lot of the photography that we purchase online for artist photo packs are multiple light source lit, which makes them pretty much useless for somebody who's first learning how to render the form. There are some that are sold that do have a direct light source in them, but it's a very rare instance when we find those. So again, for this particular section, he is stating, and it is a given, that when you're learning how to render form, you need a very clear light source. And when you have one, the head is constructed in such a way where it has a front, a back, two sides, a top and a bottom that are very clearly delineated. And by having that clear delineation, the shadow patterns are going to fall along those very specific edges and are not going to drift into other spaces, with the exception of maybe when a model is more rounded or more chiseled. The spaces might be broken up a little bit more, but they're still going to be clearly defined. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with others. If you like the content of this video and the videos that I've been providing, please sign up for the Patreon page so that you can help make more of these videos possible for all of you. I'd really appreciate it. Thank you very much, and let's continue on. I ran out of pages for my flip book, so from this section on, it's just going to be titles. Now with comparative measurements, he's taking the adult head and comparing it to the child's head. The key takeaway here is mostly with the adult head is that the head is broken into two sections, and we can divide the head directly down the middle from the front view. The top half is between the top of the skull and the bottom of the eye socket. So the bottom of the eye socket falls along here. The bottom half can be divided equally in half, with the nose falling along that boundary line. Now keep in mind that we have a good number of design strategies now. We can break the head into thirds. We can break the head into thirds with a little more, a third of a third or a half of a third added to that. We can measure the head from the top of the head to the bottom of the nose, pit of the neck, and so forth. There's a whole bunch of different design strategies. But this one is offering a really good understanding that from the very top of the skull to the bottom of the eye is 1/2 of the height. So if the hairline is obscure, because the hairline would be that other division where we can divide the head into thirds. But hairlines are high and low. So to avoid the hairline altogether as part of the strategy, using this 50-50 division is a very good process to work from. And then on the lower half, knowing that from below the eye down to the chin is another half, and within that half you can divide it in half, with the bottom of the nose and the ear resting on the same platform. And then below that, the lower half can be divided into thirds, with the mouth landing on this upper third and the ball of the chin landing on the lower third. It's a very quick and simple and easy to remember process. Now, all of the different design strategies are easy to remember, but this one has a nice quality to it with the half and half feature. And again, that's for the adult head. A child's head is broken into thirds. So with this, then, you would divide the skull into 3 sections. The lower 2/3 would be the features, the eye falling along the boundary here. Then dividing this lower third, the center of it is where the nose would fall, and then just below that, the mouth. The rest of this is cranial mass for the child. It's to protect the child's brain as it's developing. So the top of the head is larger for the child because of that very feature and very reason. So there is this kind of measurable distinction between the two. And all the same divisions apply for the profile. And here he's showing as the child ages and becomes a youth, there is this change in the way that things are measured. The division of the face is divided at the eye line, and we use the hairline as the next point of reference to make both of these sections equidistant to one another. And then what's left over, which is about half of one of those measures, is what's above the hairline to the top of the skull. And then once we become an adult, we go on to the other measure that we've already seen. So there are 3 distinct points of measure for different age categories: the very young child, the youth, and the adult. And as I've said before, there are multiple design strategies, but Bridgman's strategy works for all of Bridgman's drawings, and it's a very useful one. I don't think there is any one favorable design strategy. They're all very useful. But when you're studying from Bridgman's book, these proportions apply very specifically to his drawings. After the proportions of the head within the book, there are 3 other small sections, one on the child's head, one on the muscles of the face, and the other on expressions, which I'm avoiding because all 3 of them are not very complete and don't have a lot of useful information in them that can be really helpful for studying. I recommend other resources for those particular attributes. As well, within the features portion, I'm going to avoid the eye and the ear because both of those, the ear is a little too stylized and doesn't give good information, and there are other sources that are much stronger, and that's the same with the eye socket. The chin is also a little confusing because it's not just the chin, it's actually the entire jawline. In fact, the majority of this section is about the jaw and how it opens. But with the chin, at least with Bridgman, it is a block form facing forward. And then within that block form, he has a very strong design through here representing the rest of the jaw, where here it's not as clear, but the chin is certainly clear. With the jaw, the important thing here that he is discussing is this sort of scooped out shape that is hinged to the head. And he's describing between this page and this page how it opens. Although I would also say that this is a little strange right here in what he's discussing because he's calling attention to it swinging as opposed to dropping and rotating. As you can see here in the animation that I've designed based upon the image up here at the very top and in coordination with all the other drawings. You can see that the pivot point is back here at the bone, but it's the muscle that is opening and closing the jaw. It's a pivot point that's rotating open. So when the mouth is open, you want to make sure that the jawline has been lowered in order for the mouth to look naturally opened and not forced, in the way some of us might draw the head without thinking about the jaw moving and just opening the mouth up. I've seen that happen before with students. And the mechanism that opens the jaw is this muscle back here called the masseter muscle, which is connected just behind the zygomatic arch and is attached to the corner of the jaw. The nose is fairly complicated in its makeup, but easier to see as a big simple form with the skin fleshed over. He's created this sort of keystone shape protruding off of the forehead. And notice how it intersects the tooth barrel or the tooth cylinder. In other techniques of mapping out the face, the circle that indicates the tooth barrel cuts through the ball of the nose and the wings of the nostril to help divide them from the rest of the length of the nose. So when we draw the nose down, find the bottom plane and the side planes, we would then draw the tooth barrel, the chin below that, and the tooth barrel comes up and divides the wings and the ball shape of the nose. then the mouth will fit somewhere around in here. So that's what I would really get from this particular page, more than the renderings of the nose on either side, which are good renderings, but this is the key takeaway right here on this particular page. On this page, he's showing the breakup of cartilage. The nose is part bone. That would be this part up here, where it meets the glabella. And then the section down along through here is broken up into several parts of cartilage. There's the bridge portion of the cartilage. There's the ball portion of the cartilage. And there's the wings that house the nostril. So there's 1, 2, 3 different sections here. And from the front view, the portion that's up here again is bone. Then through this section is the bridge, the cartilage of the bridge. Through this section is the ball of the nose. And within each of these sections, you have the cartilage for the wings. You have the wings where the nostrils are. The rest of this, the side planes, is part of the skull. So all of this, and this is skull. All of these are cartilage. And because the nose is symmetrical, we only have 3 pieces of cartilage times 2 of the same type for each. 2 wings, 2 ball shapes, and 2 bridge shapes. And once again, I think this is the key takeaway drawing of all the drawings, because it shows the interaction of the nose relative to the tooth barrel that has been drawn a little larger than it actually should be. The tooth barrel is a little bit closer to the mouth and a little bit closer to the nose. Remember that some of these drawings are student drawings, so there's probably a proportion problem here, possibly because it's a student drawing, but this would be the key takeaway. And then finally, the tooth barrel. What's important here to take note of is that the mouth is drawn on a cylinder form, which means that its width is not flat against the face. The very front of the mouth is the furthest point forward, while the corners of the mouth are on these receding surfaces. This is why when you look at somebody in a 3/4 view, the mouth looks shorter on one side and longer on the other, because it's rotating around the skull. It's not on a flat surface. There's also 3 sections on the upper lip. Section number 1, 2, and 3. So this midsection comes down and overlaps the bottom lip for some, not for everybody. And then there's the 2 sides on either side of that. This is called the philtrum, right up along in here that sits above it on the tooth barrel. And then the lower lip is divided into 2 sections, this section and this section. The upper lip is the dominant lip. The lower lip envelops into the upper lip. And then we have these little hollow areas over here and over here called the modala. This is where all of the muscles that open the mouth and create the expressions are attached. And then on this page, he shows the mouth in 3/4 view, where you can't see the other side very easily. Another sort of 3/4 view, where the length of this is shorter than the length of this. And then in the profile view, which to me is highly stylized. I think that you could study from other resources and get more from them than these over-stylized mouths that have been drawn. Remember, this is sort of indicative of the time. There's a character called the Gibson girl that has a very pouty mouth, very much like this, with the upper lip drawn down pretty far, closer to the lower lip than halfway in between. A very stylized feature for that Gibson girl of the time, and something that he's taking advantage of here, more so than showing us the different variations of where the corner of the mouth actually falls, which in many cases is fairly uniform with the center of the mouth, or just slightly lower than the center of the mouth, but not to the extreme like these are, where this is almost sitting at the very bottom of the lower lip. And then the cross section here showing the dental arch and how that shapes the face and that tooth barrel. In this first part of the neck, we're going to look at the anatomy. In the second part of the neck, we'll look at the movement, although he doesn't clearly indicate the movement in there either. In this particular section of the neck, he's describing it as if we need to be seeing it from the front view as opposed to these three-quarter view turns. There are two muscles that come down from behind the ear and form at the pit of the neck. Those are called the sternocleidomastoideus muscles, which we'll look at in just a moment. His description in the book is, where is it? It's over here, bonnet strings, which is what these are. But since we don't wear bonnets anymore, I would much rather equate them to iPod cables if we're going to compare them to anything. I just like to think of them as the letter V, with the chin being up here at the top, and in between we have the windpipe, the Adam's apple, and the thyroid that sits underneath the Adam's apple. And this letter V frames all this information. This is the Adam's apple more specifically, and this is the thyroid shape. Men have a more dominant or predominant Adam's apple, while women have a more predominant thyroid gland. I'm not particularly fond of this page, although the top drawing is much better done than the bottom drawing. It's a little bit on the confusing side, and I think even with the hatching lines within this, it really doesn't serve very well to learn from, as kindly as some of the other drawings in this section do. From the back of the neck, again, a little bit confusing. We have the skull shape. The back of the neck attaches up higher than the chin is lower. There are two muscles that insert in the back of the neck, part of the trapezius muscle that we will look at when we study the back muscles. Down at the base of the neck, where it attaches to the rib cage, we have the seventh cervical vertebrae very predominant. Not on everybody is it going to be super predominant, but on most of us, you can see a bump sticking out. And then there's fascia that sits around it, so it kind of clears the space of the muscles, and you see it a little bit more flattened within this area where you see the muscle columns coming down on either side of that within the trapezius muscles. Here and here, actually not up there, sorry, here are the C7s in his drawings. And then here is another one with the muscles sort of pushed away surrounding that C7. But it isn't as clear in that drawing. It does look a little bit on the messy side. Now, one thing I want to make note of with all of the drawings, this is like the 50th edition of these drawings. We're looking at these drawings from a Dover edition book. Dover doesn't have the original transcripts of any of the books. They Xerox copy from some older version. So these drawings aren't necessarily very clear anymore because they're these copy machine copies that don't have all the fine-tuned subtlety. Old copy machines, when this Dover book was first made, were not very clear in describing photographic copies. They just made a quick, simple facsimile of the image, and about 30 to 40% of the image is lost in those copies. So we're left with these deteriorating images that we try to make sense of. And because they don't have an artistic director guiding the project, that information goes unnoticed, that it's missing. And they're more concerned with the layout of the book. So we're looking at, 50th generation images here that are very worn out. So that's why a lot of these drawings do look the way they do, because if you were to actually look at a real Bridgman drawing, and there are a few online that you can look at, they're nice and easy to read. They're done in charcoal, and the values are still, and the value structure, the line structure is still intact, where this stuff is really deteriorated. So sorry to deviate, but I just want to make it clear, because sometimes the drawings are like so close to being useful, but they're not actually all that useful. Now here's that V shape that I was describing earlier with the chin up top way up here. This is the hyoid bone. And then we have the thyroid and the Adam's apple. These are the sternocleidomastoideus muscles on either side. From 3/4 view and 3/4 front view, 3/4 side view, or profile view with the neck turned and rotated enough to make it look 3/4. We have the levator scapula that sits underneath, and that's attached to the scapula, and then connected to the spine along the transverse processes, which are these little bumps that stick off of both sides of each of the vertebrae. This is not the same thing. These are the bumps that they're attached to, and they're attached to the first 4 of your spine just underneath the skull. And then we have the sternocleidomastoideus muscle, which is attached to the mastoid process, the bump that sticks off on the side of your skull, and connects to the pit of the neck at the manubrium and to the clavicle. So the pit of the neck right here and the clavicle. And this is definitely not how they look. There's more space between them, and they're attached to both sides of the manubrium, which is sort of shaped like this. The clavicles are attached here and here, and these muscles are attached here and here, and they kind of make the pit of your neck through here. You can feel that in between on your own neck. And then we have the trapezius muscle, which is attached to the base of the skull, connected to the scapulas and the rib cage. And that covers the levator scapula. We only see a small portion of that sitting between these two muscles. And then from the profile view, very strong shape of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And then the trapezius muscle, which in this case is a little bit strange because they show the levator scapula to the outside when it's actually covered by the trapezius muscle. And then here are a couple more versions of the same makeup, and a few more, which I don't think are really all that necessary to study from. But this is, I think, the best version of all of the muscles in the neck to look at within his pages, and also shows, which should have been back on the first page, shows the hyoid bone, the thyroid cartilage or the Adam's apple, and the thyroid gland, along with the windpipe that isn't labeled. And then we have the stylohyoid, the sternohyaloid, the omohyoid, right along here, and the digastric muscle, which has 2 parts through here, all of which we really don't see very well. Most of the stuff, especially under here, is covered by the platysma, which is a big covering that he doesn't cover at all in the book, but it houses all of that information underneath. So we're not really noticing any of these muscles. And then the trapezius muscle and the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So again, this page of all the pages of the muscles, I think is the most important one to study from. The other ones are decent charts, but I think you can get a lot more, and actually both of these are the same 2 drawings just on different pages. I think you can get a lot more mileage out of this one in particular. This last section that we're going to look at is very quick and brief. It doesn't need a lot of drawing explanation. It's more about just clarifying what we're seeing here. This page right here is supposed to be the movement of the neck. And as you can kind of see, it does show 3 instances when the head is turned to the left, turned to the right, or lifted upward. And he mentions down here, for safety as well as to see and to hear, the head and shoulders must be able to turn in all directions. So we can rotate the head left and right, we can lift the head up and down, and we can tilt the head to the left and to the right. In addition, combining those movements together to create the infinite number of tilts, tips, and turns that the head can actually take. Then he says the head is a lever of the first order, which is basically this right here. And if you'd like to read the definition, go ahead and pause the video here to get a better understanding of what a first order lever actually is. It's basically what I've just kind of described here, only it gives a little bit more technical information onto the definition of that kind of movement. The drawings that are here and here are a little bit misleading because it makes you feel like the neck can only hinge from the back, which it doesn't. And it makes it look like it's mounted to some kind of pole and can only spin around. But this is a universal ball joint, and so the head has the ability to swivel around altogether. And so it's a little bit misleading. The first vertebrae attached to the skull can't really move. It's more fixed. It's between the second, third, fourth, fifth on down that the movement becomes a little more free and free-flowing in the multiple directions that the head can move in, with the spine helping accompany that movement and motion. This page shows the layers of anatomy. It doesn't actually show motion or movement. It's more anatomy, and it's built up in 3 layers. The first being the skeletal shapes, the second being the muscular shapes covering those skeletal shapes, and the third being fleshed over more and showing the sort of cylindrical flesh that covers all of those muscles. This again is the same thing, but from the front view here and here. This is the final fleshed over image from the previous page in the sequence. I think that this one right here is probably platysma, but I think also technically he's just showing the form of the cylinder that all the muscles make. And then this has the sternocleidomastoideus muscles sitting over the central cylinder of our neck, and it is also fleshed over. Then he begins the same sequence again here from the front view. Here's the skeletal masses. Here's the muscle masses, which have a slight curvature to the outside along over here and over here. If you actually look at a model who has, or somebody who's really well defined, these actually close down a little bit more and turn in almost the opposite direction. They sort of pinch together more than they are spread wide open like it is here. And then he doesn't have a finished version of that one, but he has a 3/4 turned version to sort of show you how everything sits. And this down here is pinching in a very strange way that I don't agree with. When I rotate my neck, those muscles don't close together the way his drawing is here, or the way the student's drawing is here. So I'm not really sure if I would use this image to study from. Then we have that whole process starting all over again with the back view. He shows the outline of the trapezius muscle and the levator scapulas, even though the levator scapulas are covered up even more than this, but he's showing the relationship of the spine to those muscles. Then the muscles covering the spine. And here is just another graphic image of the jaw relative to the neck and the neck muscles. It's very stark. It's very clear. It's similar to one of the earlier drawings that I mentioned. You don't really need to study from because there are better sources for it, including some of the other drawings that he has on these pages, including this one here and this one right here. Here he's showing the mechanism of the movement of the neck and how the spine and the muscles kind of work in conjunction with one another to help lift the head upward. And more really basic schematics of the muscles of the neck. So this concludes the head and the neck. I hope that this information is helpful. I know that, like I said, there's a lot of images in the book that are kind of useful to work from and some that are not. And I've mentioned a few of them that are not within this particular part of the book. I think the head and the neck, as far as anatomy goes, isn't as developed as some of the other parts of the body that he has later on in the book. And this is where I say there's other resources that you can study from that I think give you a much better understanding of how to work with all of this. The meat of this particular video was the parts of the head, the plane structure, the forms, and all of the different levels of his drawing process that shows how to break up the skull and the portrait so that we have good, comprehensive drawings with structure involved in them. I don't want to make any of this a negative at all, but I do want to help guide you through where you can spend your time and resources most effectively to get the most out of what you can from this book. Here's 3 different types of studies from Bridgman's book. These have all been sped up 200%, and I'm going to try to follow along as much as possible here. So in this first study, I start with the oval. Basically what he says in a 3/4 view, begin with an oval. Then I put in the neck, and I put in the trapezius muscles. Then blocked out the perspective just so I understand which direction the head tilt is going in, because the whole head is not visible here. This is just roughing it in. Then I'm going to widen the front of the face because this is the part where line 2 begins. So line 1, the center line, is the first one I want to block out. Then line 2 under the nose. Then line 3 under the ear. Going to block out the ear and the jawline. Follow the box as closely as I can, although I kind of drifted a little bit from it. Then the jawline on the far side. The tilt of the neck, which repositioned it, and that's forcing me to lift the trapezius up. And keep in mind and remember that you can adjust your drawings as you go. They don't need to be spot on perfect in the very first or second line stroke that you put in. I'm blocking out an underside of the jaw so that I can see it's split. Then the V shape for the sternocleidomastoideus muscles, the cylinder, and the hyoid thyroid shape, so I know where that sits. Then the pit of the neck, and then from there I'm going to start blocking out the tones of the face. So along the side of the jawline, back along the masseter muscle, I'm filling that in next. Then following the sternocleidomastoid muscle, I'm basically giving them a quick outline to note where my halftones are going to follow and flow with the form. The tendons of the sternocleido, and then I go right in and start to delineate the throat, giving it curvilinear lines so you can see the turn of the form. Then the underside of the jaw, filling that in with a stark shadow pattern. The cast shadow that goes over the thyroid, a form shadow on the underside of the shape, turning the cylinder form on the far side, which is the sternocleidomastoid muscles. So I'm trying to make sure that I capture that with curvature. Then the hollow of the trapezius and the top of the trapezius on the cast shadow side of the body. More of the pit of the neck, dropping in the form shadow that rolls into the pit, and then some of the cast shadow. The underside of the other sternocleido and the tendons, and then following along both sides of the form, because it's on the lid side, we don't put the hatch lines all the way across it. We define both sides of it. The trapezius and underneath the trap as it goes into the deeper portion of the neck, along the interior of the trapezius on this side, and then some other indications of the tendon of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. Cast shadow under the ear, hair shape, going back through the chin, on the front of the chin, defining it, and the ball of the chin. Then the rest of the cast shadow that's on the underside of the jaw. The rest of the form shadow and the form on the throat, and then double checking to see if I missed anything, putting in a few extra little hints of lines here and there where I'm comparing to the photo, just making sure that I indicate all the smaller parts of it as closely as possible, but again, not trying to be exact to the design. This exercise is using the box form, finding a random box, noting that the side that's on his face, or noting the side of the head being the larger side of the two. That's where line 2 is going to go once I block out the perimeter using facets. Then I shrunk the skull a little bit. Now line 1, then line 2, then line 3, and then line 4, following his objective order of shapes. Finding the X on the side plane so that I can place the ear correctly, and following the jawline, which was really close. Where I placed the jaw was really close to where the X line was. Then finding the rest of the masses, I'm blocking out the eye socket, the keystone shape of the nose, the brow as it goes across, and I'm placing eyeballs in here even though he didn't, just so that I have more of a good understanding of what I'm looking for, since this is trying to practice portraits or practice the head drawing. Then I'm also placing a center line that follows the forms a little more explicitly. Recurving the mouth to fit the tooth barrel, widening the cheek structure, and placing a hint of the cheek along the zygote as it goes back to the ear. Refining some of the lines, and then blocking in a shadow on the two planes to show the difference between the lit portion and the shaded portion. And then a little bit more refinement, rolling the forms with some halftones, finishing up the center line, and kind of just finessing little things here and there to clean it up. And then this third method is copying a photograph. So I start with some kind of an oval and extend the jaw. This is my approach to just blocking it in. Then using those shapes to create the facets that we saw in his method. Line 1, line 2, line 3, and then line 4 in perspective. Blocking out the ear, going across to find the other ear, so that line that I drew across is to match both ears to the same point in space. The underside of the nose, the thirds, where the eye sockets would go, and then I put in the keystone or the glabella shape. And right now the glabella and the tip of the nose are a little bit off in perspective. And as I go here, I start making adjustments to the nose so that they line up better with one another. And again, I put in the eyeball shapes using the lower lid, which is where the marker is for the eyes. The eyes are looking down, so I made sure that the ellipses are tilted downward slightly. Now I'm blocking in the masses, finding the forehead mass. It's a little more rounded, so I curved the lines. The cheekbone structure down into the muzzle area, blocking that out to make sure that it's nice and solid. The tooth barrel and the chin, making sure that each of these features is very distinct and very clear to see. Then finding the mouth, it's not quite curved to the tooth barrel yet, but I will eventually get in there and do that. And then the hairline, something that he doesn't talk about or describe. This hair is pulled back so it's really close against the skull and it doesn't do the stair-stepping that we see above the ears. And I will block out the hair again to fix it and finesse it a little bit higher on the top of the skull to show the down tilt. I blocked in the neck a little bit late. It should have been put in a little earlier, but that's okay. Again, I kind of know where I'm going with these things, so I do apologize for taking them a bit out of order. If you're new to this, you should try to follow the order that he's prescribed, but in this case, I know where I'm going with it, so I'm able to get back to it fairly easily. Now I'm blocking in some of the forms, and this is another part that I forgot to follow in order. I didn't block out the distinct shadow patterns right away. I'm just kind of loosely moving all over the head and blocking certain areas out as I'm moving from left to right and top to bottom. Now I'm going in and adding some of the cast shadow to the side that's in shadow, thickening the eyebrows, rolling the forehead, finding the split between the eyes and the definition a little bit further. Halftones on the one side, shadow on this side. making sure that the shadow is a little bit darker in value from the rest of the halftones so that there is a clear distinction between the two. He has a faint light on the other side of his face in addition to the shadow patterns, which is a little bit tough because the lighting does get darker. But I try to make sure that the shadows are very clearly dark before I put in those halftones so that there is a visual distinction between the two. Using the hatch lines to follow the form of the hair. I'm not looking for the strands. I'm just following the form of the ball shape, the sphere shape of the skull. The ponytail, then reshaping the mouth so that it fits around the tooth barrel. And then the halftones and the shadows on the far side of the face to complete the light and shadow relationships between the two. Some more detailing within the eye sockets to deepen the shadows in there. Making sure that the ear feels solid, reshaping the shadow on the far side of the neck, although I didn't really push and embellish it as dark as it should have gone. Drawing around the throat, redesigning the sternocleidomastoideus muscle on the shadow side so it has a little bit more form. And these are 3 different approaches to studying from Bridgman. Now, I'm sorry that this was a sped up version of the video. The first time I recorded this, I thought I had the audio set up and the microphone wasn't plugged in. So I had to do this overdub just to catch up with myself. So again, here were 3 methods for studying from Bridgman, and I hope this helps you a little bit more in what to do with the book when you study from it too. Well, I hope that this has helped clarify the information within this particular chapter. Like I said, not a lot of written information going along with the visuals, but the visuals follow a specific order, very much like what was shown in the first video. And each section of the body does the same thing, regardless of whether there's writing with it or not. In the next video, we'll look at the rest of the torso, the rib cage and the pelvis, and the muscles that accompany in the front and in the back. Videos following will be on the arms and the legs, and the last video will be on the hands and the feet. I hope that this really helps make your studies a little bit easier. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Thank you again for following all the way through, and if you like this information, please subscribe to the channel. Take care, good luck with your studies, and stay creative. I'll see you soon.